Welcome back, Visions fans. Ready Player Will here. So in my Dialdo review, I said I was going to cover the optimal 50, 75, 97 faith, give some thoughts on it as to why it's a little bit complex of a decision for him in particular, and I didn't actually go through that in the video itself, but figured this is a good opportunity to revisit a mechanic that a lot of people know of, maybe not know well enough, and not only walk through it as a concept, but reapply it back to Dialdo as originally intended. So today, let's start off, where is faith actually a consideration in the game? And it's in a bunch of different places. So it's how much magical damage you receive, how much magical damage you distribute, or damage you do if you're a magic unit. It's also how much healing from spells you receive and how much healing from spells you distribute or cast. It's also part of the odds of status effects or abilities activating. And finally, it's the odds of magical type counter abilities activating. So we're going to go through all of these. And we're going to look at Dialdo through each of them, and then a final recommendation. So we'll talk about the mechanics of how it works, we'll do some real-life application, and then kind of round out the thoughts so everyone can make their own informed decision about it. So magic damage, taken and received. Let's talk a little bit about how this works. And to do so, we do have to take a step back and talk about the damage formula, which a lot of people are generally aware of, but it's good to revisit every once in a while as a refresher. So recapping the damage formula, it starts with your magic stat, and a couple others. Some characters have things like agility and dexterity that feed into it, but it's primarily your magic stat, so you start with that number. You then multiply it by the sum of all your modifiers. It's basically the 165%, the 200%, the human killer, those kind of things that you add up for the total modifiers of an ability. And when you combine those two, I call that outgoing damage. And the reason being is that it's the damage you've calculated from your character that you're essentially sending at your enemy. And so just for the ease of being able to use some proper terminology, I call that outgoing damage. So once you've calculated that number and the damage is now gone and it's about to be reduced by things like enemy spirit, again, we're talking about magical damage here, but it's also reduced then by the sum of weapon resistances, element resistances, and other types like AoE unit, human resistance, things of that nature. Now, these two at the bottom, once you've put that outgoing damage through that calculation and had it reduced or increased, it's possible to increase it if you have negatives here, I call that number then mitigated damage, because you've had your outgoing damage, it's now been mitigated, and now that number continues to go through the formula here, and the next part of it is your faith multiplier, and this is where faith comes into the whole thing, so we're going to hone in on this in a second. So the faith multiplier itself is the unit's faith that's casting and the target's faith that's receiving. You add them up, divide by 100. So theoretically, if you were a 97 faith unit attacking a 50 faith unit, the modifier in this part of the equation is 1.47. Okay, so that faith multiplier here, and again, that number can change depending upon what faith values you have. That's not the end of it. There's technically two extra steps, but we're going to revisit those in just a little bit. The first one is elemental advantages and disadvantages. This is different than the elemental resistances. These are a flat 25% increase or decrease depending upon if the unit type is strong or weak. And then finally, we have things like damage reductions like shell, or you have damage increases like that newer mechanic 10% magic damage up. That's applied at the very end of the formula. So when we take a step back and look at that faith multiplier here in the broad scheme of things, let's talk a little bit about what the ranges of damage kind of are depending upon your faith level. So let's say your unit attacking, we'll say Dialdo's 97 faith here. When he's attacking an enemy unit that's only 50 faith, that modifier, as we saw, is 1.47. Now for context, that's the physical damage bravery modifier. Again, there's physical damage and magical damage. The physical damage, there's no downsides to 97 bravery in the game ever. Every unit should have it, no questions asked, no exceptions. 97 bravery, no reason not to. So the bravery modifier is 1.47. So that's going to be our baseline as the bare minimum that basically all characters do for damage. Now, it's possible that you can do more than that as a magic caster, where if the enemy unit has 97 faith, you'll actually get a much higher modifier here at 1.94. So you'll essentially take all that damage calculated, you'll multiply it by 1.94. It's a significant increase in damage over that 1.47. Now, theoretically, if your unit had less faith, these modifiers would go down. And so if you were a 75 faith unit, that's a magic attacker, going against a 50 faith unit, well, now your 1.25 modifier is lower than the baseline of all damage dealers in the game. And that's exceptionally true for 50 faith attacking 50 faith. You get no modifier, it's times 1. So the number is unchanged. And so the way I essentially try to think about this is, all right, well, this 1.47, if that's the bare minimum of the all modifiers of characters, you know, how big of an increase or decrease from that 1.47 are these others? And so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I just kind of think of it as like damage variance, where this 1.94 is a 32% increase in total damage when you attack a 97 faith unit as opposed to a 50 faith unit. 32% increased damage is enormous. And so kind of the same idea here, a 50 faith unit attacking a 50 faith unit, magic abilities, that's 32% less damage you would be doing than the bare minimum that all characters are kind of expected to do in the game. So now a lot of you are looking at this like, all right, I kind of get that. That makes sense. So obviously higher faith means more damage. We knew that. This isn't new, Will. Thanks for wasting my time. But there's obviously more to this. And some of you are also thinking one step ahead here where you're going, wait a minute. Magic percent up, we were assuming none of that at the moment, but Dialdo, again, we're tying this back into him, has 10% magic damage up as part of his Transcendence. So what that basically means is these damage variances, well, all of them you can basically add back 10%. So if we're looking at this like, you know, 75 faith unit versus the 50 faith unit, well, sure, you're maybe not achieving the maximum damage you could. Most magic damage dealers get a penalty of 15% less damage. Dialdo only gets 5% less damage compared to them. So he doesn't get hit as hard by that decrease in faith value that most other magic damage dealers do. That being said, he also deals more damage compared to the average magic damage dealer, where on that 97 versus 97, he gets 42% more damage than that base case top line here. Now, there's another thing we're talking about. We're saying, all right, damage done, but he's a tank. Well, how about damage received? I care more about that. Well, Dialdo also has Shell, which, again, we kind of omitted from this, but is an important distinction. So when we kind of rethink of this at the moment, in this instance, the unit being attacked will be Dialdo, and our attacker will be a magic damage dealer. We're going to assume that all magic damage dealers have 97 faith. And so we're asking the question, okay, so if Dialdo has 50 faith or 97 faith, what's that, you know, damage difference we're talking about? And essentially, if you keep Dialdo at 50 faith, that shell on his buff for 3 turns will reduce the baseline damage that's expected of characters by 25%. And if you go 97 versus 97, he doesn't actually take the full upside of that many other characters do, because the shell effect reduces that 32% by 25%. So he does have some protection against going as high as 97 faith when going against magic damage dealers. Again, only for the 3 turns, because it's shell, something to consider. So now, the takeaway for Dialdo, and again, this is no real conclusions yet, it's still a little muddy, and obviously intentionally so, but we'll recap it at the end once we kind of get a fuller picture. But some of the takeaways here, yeah, he'll miss out on some damage at 75 or 50 faith, but the 10% magic damage on Transcendence mitigates how much of a decrease that is compared to other magic units. So it's not the end of the world, it's not as hard of a hit as some might think, but still definitely a decrease. And although he'll take more damage at 97 faith, his shell being active negates much of that extra damage he'd receive at 97 faith as compared to 50 faith. Conclusion so far, still undecided. Obviously very subjective to who he's attacking, who you're being attacked by, etc. But now let's move on to the next phase here. Let's talk about healing from spells cast and spells received. So how healing spells work. I created this calculator quite some time ago when I did my healing video. I'll relink the link to like the public exportable view of it as well. But essentially a couple things to understand here. First of all, percent of HP restored, some abilities. And for instance, regen, the slime healing where it says like 10% of HP restored, those are not affected by faith. If something says 10% of your HP, it's 10% of your HP no matter what. But those things are affected by healing power, so don't get those confused. You can increase the percentage by healing power, but faith has no bearing on those whatsoever. It's really only the spells that are cast, and the calculation for that, and there's a part of it here where obviously takes faith into account, it's the pure magic stat of the healer, magic stat only. There's a curative multiplier, so for instance, curata is a 210 modifier. You then multiply it by the sum of healing power ups and downs. And then the final thing is a faith modifier, again, very similar to the damage calculation we did. And so if we're going to just look at some, these are actually very easy to calculate. We'll assume Velis is using snow healing on someone like Dialdo, and we'll assume Velis has 1500 magic. That's not out of the ordinary. It's a 210 modifier, that ability that he's using, the healing up and down. So Velis has 20 on a passive. I'm going to assume Velis has 10 from a Trust Stone passive, and we're going to assume Dialdo has 10 on a Trust Stone passive, as he should. So all in all, it's 40 healing power altogether, 20, 10, and 10. That's the multiplier. But then we have to do the faith modifier here. And this faith modifier is exactly the same as the damage calculation. It's the faith of one unit plus the faith of the other unit divided by 100. Same thing here. So assuming Dialdo has 97 faith, how much healing is this for him? It's 8,555 healing. And for a unit that's about 13,000 HP on average, that is a fair amount of healing. Now let's look at it if Dialdo had 50 faith instead, right? What would the healing be? So that faith modifier goes down because it's going to be 97 plus 50 divided by 100. The total healing is 6,482, so roughly about half the health pool, but that's still a lot of healing. I'd say that's still the difference between an extra hit or two before you die, so still very material. Now, got to keep in mind here, we're assuming Velis and a 210% modifier. Velis has above average healing power. That's a above average modifier that you might see. Let's look at some other scenarios. So we'll assume Queen Mashari here being a fellow Earth unit that you might pair with Dialdo, using a height-based cure, which is our Arithmetician sub. It's her main source of healing that most people use, on Dialdo standing on height 2. That's a pretty average height in the game. So 1500 magic. The modifier is much less though. It's a huge drop off from that 210. The height-based cure is only 120 and 8% per height. So 8% from one, 8% from another equals 136 total. Now healing power, Mashari, as part of her Transcendence, did get 15 healing power up. We'll assume she has 10 on a Truststone passive, Dialdo the same thing. So slightly less than the heal power, not significantly so. And we'll assume Dialdo at 97 faith. What's this total healing done? 5,342. Obviously a huge step down from the 855 that we just saw with the Velis, but that's majority driven by the change in modifier here. It's just not as strong as a curative spell. But everything else is relatively the same. And same idea here. We're going to do this with 50 faith on Dialdo. And how does that affect the healing? 4,048, again, compared to that 6,482. Overall, these two healing amounts, they're okay. I still think they're probably the difference between a whole extra attack or not that Dialdo would take before dying. But again, the question is the difference of 97 or 50 faith really worth it? Maybe not as much on these lower modifier abilities, but obviously on those higher modifier curative abilities, that's a big difference here. You're talking 2,000 extra healing off of one cast alone. But now let's look instead at Dialdo's curative ability. We've mentioned this on the podcast in my own review that he's got Cura on the Red Mage subjob. And let's see, theoretically what Dialdo's own healing is if he were to use this Cura ability on a character like Bradley, who is almost a must pick for many of these Earth teams that we see. Now, Dialdo has much less magic than those two previous people. He's really about around 1,000 magic in many builds, give or take, sticking with round numbers here. And his Cura ability is a very low modifier. It's a 120 mod. Big drop off from those two prior mods that we had. He's only got 1.2 healing power in the situation, and that's assuming that your Bradley has healing power 10. If he doesn't, this is lower. So we're actually semi-overinflating this if you don't have that on your Bradley. We'll still assume Dialdo has 10 because he should. Just part of his build, he really should have 10 healing power all the time. So already, not only are we less magic, less modifier, less heal power, that faith mod though, Bradley's only a 50 faith unit. So although Dialdo's 97 faith in this example, he's likely going to be healing a lot of 50 faith units because Earth is majority physical damage dealers. It's not exactly true, but mostly true. So the total healing he would do is 2,116. Really not that much for taking an entire turn. It's something with cast time. He's got no cast time down in his kit, so it's going to take a while. Might not even hit. The risk reward's pretty low. And again, if we're assuming Dialdo with 50 faith, well, you get no modifier on the faith mod at all. It's only 1,400 healing. Definitely not recommended. So the faith is not a significant contributor to Dialdo's healing power, really not part of that consideration. So what's the Dialdo healing takeaway here? For that 210 healing mod potential, 97 faith is a significant difference. It's basically 80% of his health pool. 50 faith is about only half the health pool. Still the potential of a full extra hit of living or dying. So even still, I think you have an argument 97 or 50 faith, but once you get into the non-210 mods, you take a big step down between the 97 and 50 faith overall for his health pool. So I think you give the edge to 97 in that case. His own Cura potential is negligible, and faith does not affect how bad it already theoretically is. And the faith, you have to remember, does not affect Dialdo's 20% counter that heals 20% of his health, nor does it affect the 10% regen on his limit break. Those percentages will remain exactly as they are, if not a little higher because of healing power, but faith has no bearing on them already whatsoever, so don't have to worry about that. But now let's talk about status effects in the math, because faith also affects that, both distributing and receiving. So we'll assume that Dialdo's the attacker here, using his 18 AP ability that's got a 25% chance to proc confusion. Well, how does this formula work? It's the caster's faith and the target's faith, pretty similar, that we've seen for most of these faith modifiers. You multiply the sum of those by the status effect multiplier minus the resistance to that status effect that your target has, and that's the percent chance that it lands. Real example, Dialdo at 97 faith here versus an enemy at 50 faith. You take that number, multiply it by that 25% chance to proc confusion. We'll assume the enemy has no confusion resistance, so 25 minus 0. The percentage chance is a 37% chance that he lands confusion. Now, just a really important thing to remind people of, because of the way the parenthetical works here, and it's essentially two sides of the equation, Trust Stone passives for 25% resistance to ailments make it impossible to be landed if it's a 25% chance to proc. 25 minus 25 equals 0. And so you might have recalled me talking about Halloween Lucia, where everyone's like, oh, she got the toad ability. It's one of those scenarios where it's like, well, if that gets really overpowering and very frequent, you just put a toad resistance rune on yourself and is a 0% chance, no matter what your faith is, 0% chance that it's going to happen. So just an important call out there. But let's talk about the general math now about all the different levels of potential faith. So this is Dialdo at 97 faith versus an enemy of 50 faith, as we just calculated, it's a 37% chance, versus another 97 faith unit, though it's only a coin flip, 49%. So it's not a majority of the time. It's literally a 50% chance, basically, of occurring. Now, if you reduce his faith, obviously there's going to decrease 31%, 43%. And if you leave Dialdo at 50 faith, it's only a 1 in 4 chance that it lands on a 50 faith unit. And even for a 97 faith unit, it's only a 37% chance. The bottom line is the highest chance you have of proccing this is 49%. So it's not like it's this massive thing that's very likely to happen and you're nerfing it. It's already a 50% chance to begin with. There's an interesting wrinkle here, though, just to kind of throw out there when we talk about, status effect math. Full life and raise are considered the same part of status effect math. If you've ever been curious about how these work, it's a 50% chance to revive. What that means is you plug in the 50% here as that status effect multiplier. That's the odds of someone getting full lifed. So a 97 faith unit getting full lifed and a caster at 97 faith, it's a 97% chance to do so. I'm sure a lot of you have been in that 3% where it fails and you're like, what the hell? But alternatively, if Dialdo is at 50 faith, you now make that essentially 3 out of 4 that it'll work. There's a 25% chance basically that it fails. But again, this is only as useful as if your healer you have has full life. If you're bringing supports that don't have it for Dialdo, then this doesn't really matter. So just kind of recapping the status effects here. Faith is best considered when status effects have a net greater than 50% chances of applying. That's typically limit breaks only. I don't think the 50% chance here is game breaking. It's a little too much RNG. Me personally, I like it when things are happening the majority of the time, which is anything more than 50%. So to me, 97 faith is great for units that have limit breaks or increased chance above 25%, a great thing to use then. I also think it's important when they have a variety of status effects, so you have more chances to apply them. It's not just on one attack. So, for instance, Zoma has a 25% chance to sleep or frostbite or slow all in his main kit at any given time, so you have more opportunities, whereas Dialdo only has the one in his main job there. And if their status effects are tied to their most oft-used abilities, so for instance, Curry with his Frost Mob Barrage, 25% chance to frostbite, he just uses that attack more than anything in his kit on average. And so yeah, if you're spamming that ability, obviously you want to maximize the potential of the status effect that just naturally goes along with it. So sure, 97 faith is great in that case, or if the status effects are particularly debilitating. Now, I don't think all status effects are equal, and roughly speaking, I kind of categorize them into 3 tiers here. Now, this is not set in stone, very enemy dependent, if it's an evade unit or if it's a mage, what the turn order of the fight is, where their positioning is, but generally speaking, I consider these top 5 in tier 1, Stop, Disable, Berserk, Petrify, Toad, because they essentially stop the unit from acting, they're not interruptible, they have a minimum amount of time until they fade, and to me, they're the highest immediate impact that it just turns something completely on its head. Now, these tier 2 ones are also still very good, but some of these can be bypassed or not get their full value. So for instance, Poison takes like 2 or 3 turns to really ramp up to full damage. Blind is great, but if they have guaranteed hit, doesn't really mean anything. Silence is debilitating, but if they're not a mage and your physical damage dealer gets silenced, doesn't really do anything, so it doesn't really matter. Stun is an interruption, but it's only 1 turn, not a couple turns. So you get the idea. These are still really, really good, but they're not that high impact lingering effect. And finally, these last three, these can be very powerful, don't get me wrong, but these are instantly dispelled the moment someone gets hit. So while Charm might be amazing to use, if you use Charm and then your teammate hits that person immediately after and Charm is gone, the status effect literally means nothing in that case. And so I do think this is part of the decision. I personally run my King Mont at 70 to 97 faith routinely because I'll typically turn most everything off except for his disable ability, which is one of my tier 1 status effects. And yeah, I want him proccing that all the time. That's a game-changing ability, so you adjust your faith accordingly for that strategy. Now, for counter abilities, this is the last thing that faith ends up affecting. How does faith interact with all of these? It's actually a little more straightforward, fortunately, as some of the other calculations. The first thing you have to do, though, is determine if the counter ability even scales off faith or not. So we'll look at Dialdo's 3 counter abilities, technically 4 in particular, once he activates his buff and unlocks this 4th one. The way you can tell if a counter ability scales off faith or not, or if it scales off bravery instead, is if you have that magic wand icon. If you have that, and Dialdo has it on all 4 of them use faith in the calculation. That's not always the case, though. A character like Summer Helena here, she's a magic unit, but her 3rd counter ability, Paladin's Guard, is that physical icon. They use the bravery on this counter ability, and faith has nothing to do with Paladin's Guard. And that's important to note because if you look at the chance to proc, it's a chance to counter physical damage here, right? Well, that's the same thing as Dialdo's Wall of Despair. It's a chance to counter physical damage, except his uses faith, hers uses bravery. So important to know that for sure. So once you've identified that, the counter ability math actually is relatively straightforward. For physical counters, again, this is not magic units, but just covering it while I can. Let's look at like Reflex in this example. Reflex has a 15% chance to proc. If you're at 97 bravery, and again, you should always be at 97, no reason not to. You take that 15% times 0.97, that's the actual chance to proc. So it's actually technically a percentage less because it's not a full 100 here. And faith, things are basically exactly the same. You take the chance that it's going to proc times the faith, and that's the actual effective chance. And all 3 of these abilities for Dialdo are a 20% chance to proc. So at 97 faith, it's a 19% chance to proc. If you lower his faith to 75, it's a 15% chance to proc. And if you lower that faith to 50, you essentially cut that in half. It's only a 10% chance to proc. And if you're considering that other 4th counter ability that has the 50% chance to proc, well, if you only have 50 faith, that's not a 50% chance. It's a 25% chance. You're greatly reducing the odds of it actually working, which is a big nerf theoretically for him. But let's talk about Dialdo's faith. What's ideal? So let's recap everything we talked about so far in the considerations of him to kind of get to this final determination. The damage done for Dialdo, how much damage does he do? Well, you miss out on some of the full upside by going 50 faith. That 10% magic damage done at the end makes up for just a little bit of it, so it's not a complete loss. Now for damage received, he will obviously receive less damage overall at 50 faith, but the shell potential does offset how much you take if you were at 97 faith, so it's not a complete loss either. So again, very, very subjective in that matchup. For the healing, Dialdo will receive a significant amount more at 97 faith, though it also depends on the support you're bringing and the potency of their curative ability. Now, faith will not impact, in my opinion, how strong Dialdo's own healing spells are, because we saw just how low they are. The faith has really no material difference, but it also has no bearing on how his survivability mechanics work between the regen and between the heal back counter. Faith has nothing to do with that. Now, status effects. While he does have that confusion access, it's not a main part of his rotation because it's not one of the higher modifiers. He'll likely be using other abilities in his kit more often, and in my opinion, it's not one of the more valuable status effects. If it was disable or stop or slow, yeah, it might be a different thing, but confusion, if Dialdo uses it on an enemy and they get hit immediately after, the confusion means nothing. And finally, the counter abilities. Now, this is one of his major strengths here. Changing the percentage to proc will have tangible impacts on how they affect the battle overall. So, my final verdict for Dialdo is 97 faith, at least at this time. Because damage taken and received is a little bit of a wash and a little bit situational, I'm basing that off the fact that right now, we're in a very strong physical damage meta. Should that change and you're in a place where there's a lot of strong magic damage dealers, sure, consider that reevaluation and consider the differences in damage received. But for now, he's not getting attacked by as many magic units, so this isn't as big of a deal to reduce that faith and take less damage. Conversely, because we are in a strong physical damage meta, most people are not gearing for spirit. And so him being a spirit scaling pierce unit, yeah, he will do a fair bit more damage at 97 faith because people aren't trying to mitigate spirit at this time, at least not as much as defense. Now, Dark Golem Vision card is coming out for those that are leaning into that. that is a hybrid Earth and Ice Vision card, which means you very likely will be mixing Velas into those teams, which is why I use it as an example. 97 Faith has an immense healing upside for him, and even for Queen Mashri, I do think it's just barely material enough. And theoretically, we have Galzak coming out too as a 50 cost unit for limited Guild War content. So yeah, when you talk about a healer for Dialdo, you're going to get something else here in the near future as well. And we look at the Confusion access. Although he has access to it, I actually do like it for a different reason. Viga's TMR, for those of you that might have it, adds Protect and the chance to Berserk on all of his attacks. So for Dialdo, who has no Protect, I like that TMR for him. And the fact that he now has Berserk optionality on all of his attacks, I think the 97 Faith is worth it, because Berserk, if you recall, is one of my tier 1 status effects. And finally, the counter abilities, I think they're too strong to nerf. It's also a big part of his survivability, that 50% one, because it reduces all physical damage by 30%. That's very strong overall. Then I don't think it's worth nerfing those counter potentials. So that's the presentation in a nutshell. Obviously in depth, and it covers a lot of things, but I don't think it's as complex as some people make it out to be. Once you understand the kind of the core of it, it really becomes more of a gut feeling and an easier decision. But that's my opinion on Dialdo in particular, the methodology of how I think about it, and hopefully this was insightful. Obviously questions, comments, critiques, always welcome in the comment section below. But that's it for now. I'll talk to y'all soon.